IPCC Report Code Red for Humanity, the Taliban capture of Kabul, Nas Daily and Whang-Od, and the Philippine COVID situation this August. Welcome to our monthly wrap-up, and this is Podcast, Conversations on Philippine History, Politics, and Society. Hello, I'm Vec.
Hello! Magandang araw, I'm Aaron.
And I'm Lee. Welcome sa isa na namang monthly wrap-up where we discuss some of the biggest news breakers for the month. And while it's true that our latest season, Contested Philippine Histories, wrapped up nito lang nakaraang linggo, our wrap-ups will continue.
And for this wrap-up, we are of course joined by a very special guest.
Yes, our special guest is an associate professor at Hiroshima University and also the host of her very own podcast called Scholars Unbound. So let's all welcome Dr. Dahlia Simangan. Hi,
Woo!
Dahlia.
Hi, Dahlia.
Welcome to the show.
Hi, Vec. Hi, Aaron. Hi, Lee. Maraming salamat sa pag-imbita at magandang araw, magandang gabi sa inyong mga tagapakinig.
Yes. Siyempre, we invited Dahlia because yung mga topics na pag-uusapan natin this episode ay pasok na pasok sa kanyang research interest, specialization.
My research interest revolves around post-conflict peace building. And recently, because now I'm involved with the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability, so we're also trying to look at the relationship between peace and sustainability or conflict and the environment. One of the global news this month that we really need to pay attention to is the publication of the International Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC report. It's a comprehensive report with more than 3,000 pages,
Wow.
detailing the scientific evidence behind climate change. Can you read that? If you cannot read that, they also have the more concise...
The executive summary.
more concise version, the summary for policymakers. And the report is also the most authoritative document on this topic because it involves more than 200 scientists. What's unique about this document compared to the past reports done by the IPCC? In fact, they have been publishing all these reports since 1990. This one, it's unique because it cannot be more certain in saying that humans are causing climate change. And this is a shift in the language because we have to understand that the summary, especially the summary for policymakers, had to be approved by relevant diplomats from 195 member countries of the IPCC. So just imagine the negotiations behind that. So in the past, the language was more conservative when it came to identifying what's the main cause behind climate change. But now it states unequivocally that climate change is caused by human activities. And this language is also carried onto the message by the UN Secretary General in saying that this report is a code red for humanity. To put it simply, if we don't act now decisively and not incrementally as we used to do, we will experience more extreme weather conditions. We are already actually experiencing them now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it will be catastrophic if we keep on emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the same rate that we are doing right now.
Last month lang, di ba, yung mga flooding sa West Germany. It was, I don't know, I think it was unthinkable just a few years ago na binabaha sila. Di ba? Problemang third world yan before eh. So now, talagang, before kasi laging sinasabi na, ang perpetrator ng environmental degradation nangyayari mula sa mga industry or ginagawa mula sa mga industriya perpetrated by, large Western companies and multinational corporations. Pero ang nagsasuffer ay tayo sa Global South. Diba? We experience the worst of it. Pero recently, mas universal na yung nagiging implication nitong climate change. And I wonder if the fact that, the people from the West or in the developed world are already experiencing the consequences of the climate change. Tingin nyo ba magiging mas decisive yung measures na iti-take ng international community regarding this, and then provided pa this most recent and compelling evidence by the IPCC?
Ako, ang worry ko is that when the news of this IPCC report and the literal doom it foretells us, is that it's difficult to focus on this terrible news. We are, after all, fighting another battle, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Kumbaga, yung atensyon sana na karapat-dapat natin ibigay sa issue ng climate change ay hindi na ibibigay. Sa panahon na sana ay pagtuunan din natin ng pansin itong climate change kasi may mga naniniwala pa rin na it's a hoax. We've been talking about climate change for quite some time now, and we have this report now saying na, hey, it's virtually certain that it is bound to happen. Pero parang hindi na spotlight.
Yeah, no, actually yung binanggit ni Dahlia kanina is very striking talaga, I think, for this IPCC report, because I mean the discussions about climate change and then the language shifting to, I mean, being more climate crisis has been going on since the 1970s, with all of the negotiations and the meetings, the all the bodies that were convened to try to study what's happening. It's been going on since for like almost
30 years.
half a century already. And yet, 'di ba, parang hindi pa rin nagigising in a way yung madami, kasi marami pa rin yung climate crisis deniers sa mundo, na kahit na overwhelming yung evidence for it. So I hope that the IPCC report right now, and katulad yung sinabi ni Vec, dovetailing to what Vec said, na nangyayari na rin yung severe climate conditions sa global north. I hope it really nudges the global governance architecture towards a more decisive stance towards this issue. Pero I don't know kung mangyayari siya. 'Di ba? Parang hindi naman natin ma-predict yung future. Pero I don't know, parang I want to ask Dahlia din na parang paano ba ngayon yung tingin mong magiging move ng UN, ng iba't ibang,
Parang
diba,
sa sustainability perspective, ano ba ang approach talaga dito sa most recent development na to?
Or we can even talk about this from a historical perspective, because I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not a sustainability scientist, so I cannot really comment on the science behind this. But I think what would interest scholars and students of history for this podcast is that despite the fact that, as you've mentioned, the global north countries are already experiencing this, it's becoming more real that eventually it will impact all of us. Pero may mga inequalities pa rin surrounding the contributions of greenhouse gases, right? And how we experience climate change. And here I actually want to question us. Who are the human beings as a collective when we talk about climate change? Of course, now we have the large economies of some of countries in Asia, but those are minuscule if you think about it compared to the historical emissions, as well as per capita emissions, by the way, of large industrialized countries in the West. So we also cannot ignore the impact of European colonization and industrialization, not only the environmental impact, but also the socioeconomic impacts of those. And we are still experiencing the impacts of those things, right? And this also influences our resilience and our ability to respond to climate change. We have to always keep in mind that countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are also countries that are colonized by these large greenhouse gas emitters, historically speaking. And much of the populations of these countries rely on livelihoods that will be disrupted by climate change. And if we take a closer look at some of the sustainability indices, right? Lee, we are actually studying this at Hiroshima University. Those with supposedly greener economies actually outsource carbon-intensive industries to developing countries. The carbon leakage, right? So, and some of these countries are being vilified for their unsustainable practices. Of course, they still have to curb the emissions. But para sa atin, it's really important for those who will experience the worst of the worst, kumbaga, to be a part of the conversation on how to respond.
Definitely.
Climate change is a global problem that requires global solutions, often said, right? But in our conversations and hopefully actions, we need to really acknowledge this differentiated vulnerabilities and maybe local solutions too. Without, of course, instrumentalizing local practices and local knowledge, and without passing on the burden of responsibility to the already vulnerable populations. For Filipinos as an archipelago with indigenous knowledge and practices that are relatively, I would say, more sustainable and with more coexistence with nature, but whose indigenous communities have been colonized or marginalized, as you have discussed in your previous episode, the Philippines, the Filipinos, must demand inclusivity and be really active and truly engaged in this conversation surrounding climate change.
That's a very compelling idea, no? Yung sinabi ni Dahlia na dapat merong differentiation when it comes to expectation kung paano mag-respond. Pwede ba nating i-extend yon to say that there should also be a more commensurate accountability?
Responsibility.
Yeah, and responsibility. Pwede ba nating i-argue yun na since kayo naman yung greatest perpetrator ng environmental problems sa kasalukuyan, then I think you should, be taking more responsibility and, giving more resources towards its correction and its alleviation.
Diba? Parang yan yung activist stance na global justice perspective. Diba? Na parang calling out
climate justice.
Global North that climate justice, that since you are the ones who had the most significant carbon emission during the height of the Industrial Revolution, diba? Tapos parang I think maganda ding i-counterbalance dun yung perspective na sinasabi ni Dahlia na power asymmetry, diba? Kasi minsan din yung conversation is about pag yung developing country yung nag-industrialize, kino-call out kasi hindi sustainable yung approaches to industrialization. So parang minsan yung binabaling din yung conversation na parang, well, you had your chance, that's why you're industrialized. So now that we are trying to industrialize, you are telling us to stop because we are destroying the planet. But in truth, you were the ones who were actually doing it since time immemorial. So parang yun yung, I think, yung clash, diba? Na parang saan tayo pupunta? Saan tayo lulugar?
Saka sa akin, ang bago kasi to, kaya natuwa ako dun sa, hindi dapat ako natuwa. na
end of the world na.
Na-perk up yung interest ko. Nung sinabi ni Dahlia na dun sa mga supposedly greener economies, yung mga carbon-intensive nila na industries, ina-outsource nila. So, yun pa pala yung isa sa mga pinakamalaking problemang dinudulot ng globalization or more precisely ng neoliberal globalization na hindi ka lang nag-outsource ng cheap labor, okay, inhumanely cheap labor, pero dinedestruct mo rin yung environment ng developing world.
And yet you blame them. You blame them for climate change or for their emissions,
You're washing your hands of the responsibility.
Or I think
they're the ones doing
yung mismong babalik sabi nga historical, no? Pero yung mismong enterprise ng colonialism itself, I think is
very exhaustive.
If we're going to compute yung damage na nagawa ng mga ito talagang babalik tayo sa West at sa mga kasalanan nila sa global community.
But we are not saying that just because we were colonized or we are from lower income countries, we're not gonna contribute to the solutions to climate change, right? It's just that we have to really acknowledge, the shortcomings that probably we have, that we are unable to match the capacity of these industrialized Western countries.
This month, August 15, Kabul fell in the hands of the Taliban, following, of course, the announcement of US President Joe Biden that they would be pulling out American forces from Afghanistan. Of course, the announcement was finalized April of this year. And then when the American forces started to, withdraw their troops in different parts of Afghanistan, they relied on the Afghan security forces. Sabi kasi ni Joe Biden, it is high time that we end America's or the United States' longest war. So the Taliban met very little resistance and they eventually expanded their hold of the country until they were able to capture the capital middle of this month. This happened 20 years after the Taliban was defeated by the Americans during the Afghanistan invasion in 2001 following the 9/11. Of course, the resurgence of the Taliban in power spelled a lot of doom considering the experience of the country from 1996 to 2001 when Taliban led it after they won the Afghan Civil War, which actually followed the Soviet occupation. 20 years after the overthrow of this Islamic fundamentalist rule of the Taliban, we have come to this tragic conclusion, tragic considering how the Taliban ruled Afghanistan for 5 years. When, women were virtually left out without rights, they couldn't get out without a male relative accompanying them, for example. They were barred from entering school, from working. There was also events of cultural genocide which happened in Afghanistan and so on. But I would like to point out the short history of the Taliban in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union then occupied Afghanistan. Of course, there was resistance to that, syempre, di ba? So may mga lumaban sa Soviet occupation ng Afghanistan. So these were different groups actually, and they were actually funded indirectly by the United States through the CIA. Because, of course, we know that during the Cold War, magkalaban sila, di ba? So, they funded these Islamic groups. And when the Soviet thought that, this is not worth it anymore, this is causing too much trouble and too much pressure, so they finally went to the negotiating table by 1989. So, the years that followed the Soviet occupation were years of intense fighting, intense civil war among different groups. And among those groups was actually the Taliban. And the Taliban consisted of young, educated men, but were actually educated in Islamic schools. All right. So, and during this time, analysts and scholars of Afghan politics would say that the way that the Taliban operated in Afghanistan was very localized. Hanggang ngayon naman, that's what they're saying. Parang talagang they're building local bases muna. And then from there, they go upward. And during this time, they won Afghanistan over in 1996. What was their rhetoric? It was very simple. They were offering security, stability, and peace. And if you are in the midst of the civil war, this was something really appealing. And they started these campaigns in the local regions of Afghanistan. And they capture the imagination of the people. And in the first year of their rule in Afghanistan, they weren't talking about, public execution of women or disallowing women from working. This came later on. 1996 to 2001, they ruled. So it was just cut short when the Americans, invaded Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks because they were accusing the Taliban of coddling Al-Qaeda. So they were pushed upward. So ang sinasabi nila, pareho yung nangyari ngayon. In the midst of, American bombs dropping in their communities, Taliban once again resorted to the simple rhetoric of peace and security, and that made them win people over. But of course, syempre, mas komplikado pa yan eh. Like, sabi nila, may mga conspiracy or sabwatan na nangyayari sa pagitan ng Afghan government at ng Taliban. So they made lots of concessions. And they were also, there were also some allegations of corruption. The insight here is that we need to understand that the Taliban operates in a very local level. For example, right now, some areas led by the Taliban claims that they would allow women to work. But some areas would say na no, they will not do that. Okay, so yun yung tingin kong dynamic na kailangan nating tingnan. And I think it would be wrong, and it would be very dangerous actually, to view Taliban as a very monolithic group and institution. Because how can we respond properly? Diba? Or we would always be at the risk of, overstepping na naman and becoming more oppressive than the oppressors that we're fighting if we will approach Taliban in a very monolithic way. So what can you say?
I'm very confused with this issue. I remember just a year ago, I was arguing with a classmate in a graduate class on conflict resolution about Afghanistan. Yung point niya ay, paano kung hindi pumasok ang US sa Afghanistan? E di lalong kawawa daw yung Afghanistan nun. Ang argument ko naman ay, well, we don't know that because it didn't happen, right? It's counterfactual. Ang point ko ay, kailangan natin i-critique yung global role ng Estados Unidos at yung idea ng American exceptionalism or the insinuation that a country or one country is a unique force of good for the world. And then, when the Taliban takeover of Kabul happened, I remember I read a tweet by Johan Galtung, the founder of the Field of Peace and Conflict Studies. Sabi niya, nagalit daw sa kanya dati yung mga diplomats on military operations in Afghanistan kasi he pointed out that, and I quote, "As you now enter the country, beards will be shaved and concessions made until you depart. Then beards will return and you will become folklore." End of quote. And then, here we are. I think it's not wrong to say na may mali sa approach ng peace building in this case. Was the decision to pull out a mistake? Or was the way the exit was done, yun yung naging problema?
Yeah, and I think it's already really a global concern because, diba, I mean, China is chiming in with trying to call out the world and telling the world that they are supporting the Afghans in their self-determination in directing their own history. So may mga ganun na siyang dimension diba, na superpowers are already pitching in. Pero I agree ako dun sa sinabi ni Vec na it has a long history. So I mean, we can even go to philosophy, yung Wahhabism and all of those, yung iba't ibang Islamic doctrines that come into play. Pero I want to hear actually Dahlia's points here from a peace building perspective kasi diba it's been going on for so long. Parang kasi I read Dahlia's book on peace building, yung iba't ibang approaches. Yeah, so I want to really hear what you think about this kasi diba you studied different contexts, Kosovo, iba't ibang Cambodia, diba iba-ibang context. So I want to hear your perspective on this na parang pag ganito na in a West Asian Islamic state that has gone through fundamentalist governance, Western incursions, how do you tackle peace building? Diba?
How do we tackle peace building? Yeah, very, very difficult, as Lee said. And I commend Vec for a very impressive summary of this complicated history. And it's really difficult to comment with certainty on the rapid and very alarming, as Vec mentioned, alarming developments in Afghanistan. But as we always say, we cannot predict the future, but we can always analyze what's happening right now because of what happened in the past. And thank you, Aaron, for bringing up that my work on peace building. So I'd like to comment on the peace building process in Afghanistan, especially the international intervention led by the U.S. Through military deployments and also the UN through the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan. In 2002, authorized in 2002, I believe. So it's important to recall the UN mission in Afghanistan was deployed at the time when there was a growing realization within the UN or within the international community about the limits or the shortcomings of a large-scale, highly international and very top-down state building and peace building processes. And this was their template in international peace building in post-conflict societies, right? At that time, especially in Kosovo and in East Timor. So when the UN deployed in Afghanistan, the intent was to have this quote-unquote light footprint approach advocated by a prominent UN diplomat, Lakhdar Brahimi. Brahimi also served as the UN special representative in Afghanistan. So this light footprint approach was very much aligned with the local turn in peace building, that internationals need to take a step back and let the local actors and agencies drive the peace building process. Of course, it was a welcome shift for researchers, for practitioners in terms of intervention strategy, because it was supposed to bolster Afghan capacity, to encourage local ownership of the institutions and the local ownership of peace. In paper, it sounded really great. And of course, the international community, at least in the short run, we can say that the international actors have done some tremendous and courageous work in Afghanistan. But in practice, the strategy actually kept changing, and the state building and peace building processes are sometimes not complementary. So it remained still very top down, at least centered in the capital Kabul, by the way, with very limited involvement or participation from the other parts of the country. It was also highly technocratic, with international consultants coming into Kabul, and of course this resulted in salary inequalities, right? Internationals having more salaries compared to their local counterparts. And this also resulted in what we call the parasitic bubble economy. Simon Chesterman observed this way back then. And much like the question, because I want to connect this also with that IPCC report, the question of who do we mean by humanity in the context of climate change? In this case, we can also ask, who are the locals, right? How representative are these locals? Are they really invested in peace? again, we can connect this with the issue of greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know if this is a stretch, but according to a study by Netta Crawford and also a study by Oliver Belcher and his colleagues, the U.S. military's global supply chain makes it the largest institutional consumer of oil and one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters, more than majority of the countries around the world. And Afghanistan is also one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, with farmers, pastoralists being challenged by more frequent and more severe droughts. And as we know, it's likely that when you strip people of their livelihoods, they would harbor feelings of discontent that can be channeled to violent acts such as terrorism. Sabi nga ni Aaron, Afghanistan is a global issue. It's an international issue that requires international response. And we can start with the humanitarian response immediately, providing immediate assistance, especially to women and children, like Vex said, providing refuge and other immediate forms of assistance. And later on, our responses must be cognizant of the fact that Afghanistan is not just Kabul. And if a genuine local ownership of peace is really the end goal here, then the international community, especially the US and other major powers meddling in the country, should not do the same mistake of parading local ownership, but not really implementing it on the ground, and parading local ownership, but really alienating local actors and agencies in other parts of the country.
I really like that point that Dahlia made about a humanitarian approach to responding to the situation in Afghanistan. Kasi sometimes, syempre yung ibang global north, madalas talagang security stability
militaristic
nexus yung approach na as long as I'm safe, diba, parang you need to get your shit together because you're gonna affect me. Pero pag humanitarian yung approach, mas ano tayo na, diba, na parang tingnan natin yung local condition nga nila. No. Yeah, lalo na ng vulnerable groups.
Just one last thing. I also want us to recognize now we are debating this issue of Afghanistan, and there are people right now in Afghanistan really experiencing life-threatening events and incidents over there. So I hope by this conversation we are showing our solidarity with the people in Afghanistan.
Yes, definitely.
That's very important.
Ako siguro last point lang, iniisip ko kasi with the Afghanistan situation, how it can impact the peace and security situation in Mindanao.
Yes.
Especially ngayon na medyo fragile pa rin naman yung Bangsamoro situation since it's still transitioning. When news of the civil unrest in Afghanistan broke nga, I read some news that the PNP was on alert kasi they believe that local terrorist groups in Mindanao can be inspired or influenced by what the Taliban did in Afghanistan. Just goes out to show that these events on the other side of the globe can and will impact us. So nito nagsimula ang August, we all heard about this sort of battle between influencers. But the root of it was Whang-Od, isang mamabatok or traditional tattoo artist sa Kalinga, one of the oldest artists still practicing this traditional cultural craft. Meron dapat siyang course sa educational technology platform na Nas Academy nitong sikat na influencer, at least sa Pilipinas, na si Nuser Yassin o mas kilala bilang Nas Daily. Ang sabi ng side ni Whang-Od, walang pinirmahang kontrata para dito sa kursong ito. Na para matik ng mga tao, kailangan nila magbayad dun sa Nas Academy. So money-making scheme din talaga siya. Kawing-kawing na usapin ito, Una, yung commodification ng traditional art at ng isang living cultural treasure na itong ang si Whang-Od, kasi kikitaan itong si Nas yung art form at si Whang-Od mismo. Ikalawa, wala raw consent at agreement between Nas Academy and the camp of Whang-Od. At pangatlo, yung palagi nilang napaggamit sa mga Pilipino at sa mga interest natin bilang isang kultura, bilang content nitong mga influencers tulad ni Nas. Ano masasabi niyo tungkol dito?
Yes, sobrang... Nung nakita ko to, nung una ko nakita yung release na to ng Nas Academy, ng parang masterclass on Kalinga tattooing, sobrang nag-cringe na ako. And I was actually wondering kung bakit wala pang backlash from the community, from IP activists and IP rights advocates. Kasi sobrang off talaga siya. Because imagine, you will teach the traditional art or traditional practice of tattooing amongst outsiders facilitated by a foreigner. So, ang una kong naisip dito ay yung konsepto ng free, prior and informed consent or FPIC na requirement actually ng National Commission on Indigenous People regarding accessing indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, kahit nga researchers kapag pupunta ka sa field sa isang community to do research, yung mga anthropologists natin, kailangan mong mag-secure ng FPIC. So yun yung una kong naisip. Meron kayang FPIC itong sila Nas. So as it turned out, mukhang wala. Okay? So ang idea ko dito ay and the retort of Nasir Yassin on the issue was that they actually went through the process, nag-show siya ng picture with Whang-Od
video
signing or printing her thumb dun sa contract supposedly. So basically sinasabi niya na kasinungalingan yung sinasabi ng apo ni Whang-Od that we didn't secure consent. We did. Here are the pictures. But, that just goes to show that Nas Daily did not understand indigenous knowledge. Okay? Na yung konsepto ng indigenous knowledge ay hindi mo hihingin ang consent ng isang individual kahit pa si Whang-Od yan. Kasi indigenous knowledge is quote-unquote owned and claimed by the community. So, ibang proseso yan. And then, that's one thing. Yung isa ko ngang teacher sa UP Baguio, Dr. Annalyn Salvador Amores na nag-aral ng Kalinga Tattooing, sinasabi niya, ang comment niya, ang isa niyang comment na nag-strike sa akin regarding consent ay why did Whang-Od printed her thumb mark in the document instead of signing it? She can write her name. She's not illiterate. She can sign. I saw her write her name, parang ganon. So, I don't know kung bakit ganon. And then recently nagkaroon ng press release ang NCIP Cordillera Administrative Region concerning the results of the review that they did regarding this issue. At ang conclusion nila ay Apo Whang-Od did not consent or was made aware that she was going to teach Kalinga art in the Nas Academy. The Kalinga art of tattooing in the Nas Academy. Sabi din nila, it wasn't explained to them well. Okay? Which was actually already very very problematic, So, yung isa niyang apo, si Stella pa lang daw, sabi niya, the provisions of the contract were not explained to them except that they were made to sign the contract of filming, interview, photography, walang teaching. I think they would know kasi, they would know that it would be wrong for them to teach the art. Iba kasi yung tatatuan mo yung hindi taga-community, iba yung tuturuan mo kung paano magtato.
Tsaka paano yun? O dapat may sarili kang uling, may sarili kang...
Sarili kang pomelo, thorn and all. I don't know. So marami pa, sobrang masalimuot yung issue. Pero, I think tama na nagtatay back dun sa issue ng ng Pinoy baiting. Diba? So, I think, tingin ko, magbabalik talaga to dun sa issue na hindi kasi nila alam yung nature ng indigenous knowledge. At sabi pa, nung mga attorney ng NCIP, the contract was to be governed by Singaporean laws. Kung saan naka-based ang Nas Academy. Yeah. So, I don't know.
I didn't know that. Oh my God.
Yeah. So, it's a very, very complex and nakakainis na issue, kumbaga. Especially if you know...
Nakakainis.
Especially, provided, our last episode na pinag-uusapan natin kung paano laging ina-exoticize at, mina-marginalize ang mga indigenous people sa Pilipinas. So, yeah. What can you say?
Classic example of instrumentalization or commercialization of indigenous knowledge and culture, kahit pa intentionally or unintentionally. Gusto ko lang i-connect sa peace building practices din kasi if internationals are really aiming, Nas can be considered an outsider and international to the Philippines, so are really aiming to involve or engage meaningfully the locals. They have to also constantly question their positionalities, parang what's in it for me vis-a-vis what's in it for the locals. Because Nas, it's obvious that he's stuck in this navel gazing when it comes to this broader issue such as such as our indigenous communities, without really engaging in a meaningful dialogue, or maybe even letting someone else, like Whang-Od, really lead and direct the dialogue. Pero this conversation should not be driven by outsiders, I think. By the way, outsiders can also be Filipinos. So even internally, Filipinos can be outsiders to some of the indigenous or local communities.
So it is rather disappointing kasi the Philippines has the most advanced and comprehensive laws on indigenous peoples. I mean, tulad nga nung binanggit ko dun sa recent episode namin, yung Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, dyan pinattern yung UNDRIP eh. So, and a foreigner, goes here and, I don't know, commodifies this...
Exploits.
And exploits this culture. Very, very disappointing. Parang hindi naman siya nagbasa-basa, ano? Hindi siya nag-research.
Very interesting din, no? Kung paano yung issue ni Nas ay parang sinausawan din ng ibang issues at nakakatawa rin kasi usapin din siya ng exploitation, yung kay Luis Mabulo at yung galit niya kasi hindi raw natuloy yung pag-feature ng Nas Daily sa kanyang
Cacao Project.
Yeah. At ang sabi naman ni Nas, kasi hindi naman kayo totoong social enterprise asyenda kayo Parang ganun yung sinabi ni Nas, ano.
Panginoong may lupa ka sabi niya.
Panginoong may lupa kayo, parang yung mga farmer na yan, mga mga
tenant
trabahador nyo So, ang dami ng sumausaw na issue, pero exploitation. At the end of the day, no, exploitation pa rin din talaga tong issue na ito. And ewan ko, ako kasi masaya ako kapag hindi ko alam kung sa anong ugat nito. I like it when foreigners enjoy Jollibee. Is it because I'm outside the Philippines? But is it because parang na-clickbait na ako as a Pinoy ng content na tulad nito? Pero parang ganito rin kasi yung...
Kailangan mo kasi
lang...
Hindi
ko Pinoy pride sensibility.
Pinoy pride.
Nabibis ko lang ba yung Jollibee?
No, we always need colonial...
Pinoy pride.
we always need colonial validation.
Alright, so we now go to our last issue for this wrap-up, of course. It's our monthly COVID situationer. We are over 1 year into the COVID pandemic in the Philippines. At syempre, ang August ay hindi nagpahuli sa mga newsbreaker events dahil nangyari ngayon, syempre, ang surge ng Delta variant. As we are recording today is August 30, we recorded 22,000 cases in the Philippines with a 27% positivity rate. Can you imagine that? 1 in 4 people can be positive pag na-expose sa COVID. So it's burdening the health sector again. At yung PGH, halimbawa alone, the Philippine General Hospital has closed its doors dahil na-overwhelmed na sila ng COVID cases. So it speaks so much about the situation kasi many doctor friends nga would say that the PGH would really find ways to accommodate people kahit na punong-puno na. But for the PGH to actually release a statement na hindi na kayang tumanggap, that speaks so much about the situation. And of course, the trends are continuously becoming more frightening dahil patuloy yung pagtaas daw ng cases. At syempre, in line with this, we are expecting more from the government sana in responding to the pandemic better. But of course, we are not getting that from the government. No, at this month also, na-expose through the report of the Commission on Audit the misplaced priorities of the Department of Health in terms of spending and actually allocating funds in responding to disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic. So, it caused such a stir kasi talagang na-call out yung Department of Health at in true Duque fashion, nag-respond siya like a crybaby saying na siya ay winarak ng Commission on Audit to the point insinuating na bakit nangingialam ang COA in the time of the pandemic. And of course, this is very telling when we talk about the institutions that we have kasi syempre we all know, we should be reminded that the Commission on Audit is a constitutional body that was established with the 1987 Constitution precisely to become a watchdog of government spending, no? Kung paano ginagamit yung pera ng bayan. So here you are, COA doing its job and being faulted for it, no? So at syempre ngayon lang this last week, lumabas din ang issue nung Pharmily, that small pharmaceutical company supposedly that got all the government contracts or majority of the government contracts amounting to billions with regard to supplying materials for the COVID response. So, of course, this brings out so many issues and questions about corruption, cronyism, and of course the overall government response. And amidst the Delta variant and the new variants that are sprouting here and there, we are still talking about ECQ, MECQ, and all the ECQs that are being imposed in the Philippines. So, it's a grim picture. I don't know what you would like to say about this situation.
Ako gusto ko kayo i-congratulate for not being here. Stay where you are. Sobrang saklap ng mga balita talaga. Imagine, in the midst of this is the worst moment that we had since the pandemic started in March 2020 with 22,000 cases. I mean, naalala ko a few months ago, nung nag-10,000 yung cases, nagwawala na ako. Kasi nagagalit na ako. Kasi bakit ganun? Tapos ngayon, more than double na yung number. And, the real measure of how bad it has gotten was the fact that the virus has already been close to me. I've had family succumb to the virus. I've had friends who has been, infected. It was never disclosed before. I sympathize with everyone who had to suffer it since last year. Pero sobrang totoo na kasi even those who are supposedly who aren't supposedly at risk, yung mga hindi naman lumalabas ng bahay, wala naman trabaho na regularly, hindi naman frontliner, ay talagang naaapektuhan nung virus, nagsisimatay at mga nagkakasakit sila. So, tapos makikita mo dito, the experience is very real, all right? And then nababalitaan mo that they're pillaging the government coffers, the money of the people to corruption. Itong Pharmily na sinasabi ni Aaron, nabasa ko kanina lang na yung capital lang nito before ay more than 500,000 pesos. 600,000 pesos, give or take. Tapos yung contract na nakuha nila ay billions of pesos already. So imagine people a lot of Filipinos are dying and they will continue to die. And these people are getting really, really rich. Diba? So,
let's not even talk about the face shields. Let's not talk about the face shields.
Yeah, that damn face shield. Oh my God. Imagine nag-drive ka, naka-face shield ka. Oh my God. So, yeah. I'm so angry, I can't talk.
Hindi naman natin kailangan maging expert sa government procurement to know definitely. That there's something wrong, no? With a company with such capitalization to get a 1 billion peso project from the government, knowing that yung mismong government procurement system naman ay supposedly protects the government from anomalous transactions like that. And yet, ibig sabihin talaga may nangyaring kakaiba sa transaction or sa procurement na yan.
Yeah.
Pero ako gusto ko mag-react dun sa winarak nyo kami ni Duque. Na parang, hindi ko alam.
Very
pero
strong, no?
Oo, diba? Parang talaga extreme na eh. Destroyed eh. Alam mo yun. Parang,
may problema ba sa... Or I think this is because of Duterte din, that the way that our public servants, the way they react, the way they talk to the people, parang so emotional. We have Teddy Boy Locsin, who's always a fan of ad hominem, nakikipagmurahan sa mga people on Twitter. Tapos we have the people like, Bato and sino to? Yung Bongo, na umiiyak-iyak sa Senate hearing. I don't know. Naubusan na ba tayo ng public servants who are, actually professionals who would not really show their... I'm not saying that they should withhold their emotions in public, pero in these trying times, I think we need leaders who can actually control their emotions and lead us, no? Hindi yung mag-iiyak ka on national television.
Act.
Yes, na parang, is this the new style of Philippine governance?
They're trying to pull off a Duterte, thinking that they can do it. They can't. Yung mga ganong style kasi, si Duterte lang yung makaka-carry nun. So, I think yun.
Yun yung naiinis ako kasi may pandemya na ang dami nang namamatay. Umiiyak naman na talaga yung mga tao sa paghihirap. Pero iiyakan din tayo ng mga leaders natin. Eh di ano pa, mag-iiyakan na lang tayo dito. Tapos yung issue pa ng pera at ayaw magpa-audit, and yet nakita natin yung budget ng UP ay bababaan.
Yan, slash.
Ika-cut.
1.3
At lalo na
billion.
at saan na pupunta yung pera? Sa end, ito na naman tayo
Sa
sa
Familia.
this monstrous this monstrous government agency called the NTF-LCAC, di ba? It's a mouthful. It's an
red
ugly
tagging
named
machine.
agency. The red tagging machine I think it's getting billions, no? Parang kung ikukumpara sa budget ng UP.
Oh my God.
So are they being held accountable?
Yun nga di ba?
Wala kasing
That's-
wala kasing check and balance for this administration. So who will COA na nga lang eh. At hindi pa judicial body ang COA. They're just saying na anomalies are happening but they have no means to, to impose sanctions. 'Di ba? Tapos dinudurog pa sila ng administrasyon. Kasi iba pang aspeto yung vaccines.
Oh yeah.
Yung shortage ng vaccines, lumabas din ngayong buwan yan. Imagine, ang daming nakukurakot na pera, pero sobrang kulang yung bakuna. Kaya yung mga yung
At kumukuha
lamentations
pa ng
natin.
supply from the COVAX initiative before, ha?
Yeah.
Meron pa tayong nakukuha from that. So, parang
Majority
Saan
ng
na?
vaccines ay donation. Dinodonate lang. Hindi man lang nila pinoprocure. So, dati ang issue natin ay yung possible na vaccine hesitancy dito sa Pilipinas. Walang ganun ngayon.
Wala.
Diba? Shortage talaga yung problema.
yeah. And I think looking forward din talaga kasi we are of course close to the filing of candidacy of the candidates for the 2022 elections, 'di ba? Nakakatakot lang din talaga yung effect, the Duterte effect, quote unquote, sa perception on institutions, 'di ba? Kasi yung idea before, 'di ba, the CHR has been demonized. Tapos ngayon yung COA, alam mo yun, yung mga watchdogs na institutions
Nauna Supreme
that
Court
are-
nga di ba?
Supreme Court
Ombudsman.
that that are there, that are supposed to be checks and balances with governance, ay nakikita na hindrance, pinipaint as hindrance to good governance, where in fact yun yung role nila, diba? So yun lang din. So siguro we can end this episode with that point na Rodrigo Duterte has openly declared that he is willing to run for vice president.
Oh my God.
In
How
the next
absurd.
And when he wins daw, ay siya ang gagawa ng trabaho ng COA. Na parang, do you know how this government works? Do you know what the Constitution is? Abogado siya, di ba? Pero parang hindi niya alam yung proseso. But I think this has been his style of politics.
Yeah.
And this is what the people like about him actually.
Parang ngayon may problema ako bago matulog. How can we hold them accountable though?
Wala, kailangan talaga mag-change ng government.
Yeah.
They will not hold themselves accountable. Kasi wala na-monopolize siya yung 3 branches eh.
So we have to vote.
Yeah, I think that's the only way, no? Magbago ng presidente at magbago ng administration.
And one way to do that, of course, is for us to go out and vote. So we are calling on our listeners, if you are 18 years old by May 2022, you are an eligible voter. So register to vote. It's only up until September. I think there are calls to extend it because of the ECQ. Pero of course, please register to vote. Lalo na yung kabataan, because we are comprising the majority of the voters.
That's right, no? Alam mo, when Rizal said na kabataan ang pag-asa ng bayan, he wasn't joking. Like, right now, kung lahat ng kabataan boboto sa susunod na eleksyon, I think we really can make a difference. So, and I think we reached the end of the show. So, we would like to thank our special guest for this episode of our monthly wrap-up, Dr. Dahlia Simangan. Thank you very much for being here today.
Yes.
Dahlia, if you would like to promote your podcast.
Yeah. Thank you. If you're interested in conversations surrounding academia, especially conversations from the Global South, you can visit www.dahliasimangan.com/scholars-unbound. Thank you, Lee, Vec, and Aaron for having me here. And keep the conversations going.
That was August 2021. So if you want to learn more about the show, please visit our website. That's www.podcast.org. And to keep being updated with our episodes, please follow us on our social media accounts. We have a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So thank you very much for listening and have a good day.